So, Milton Bennett, very pleased that we can meet and talk about your work. I have a first question, and this is interesting for Interculturalist. What was an event, what was something very important in your life that made you to become an Interculturalist?
Yeah, nice question. So let me give my parents some credit before I take some credit for myself. But I recall at a very early age, partially I recall it, partially I was told about it. Living in Seattle, Washington, Pacific Northwest of the U.S., my parents said we lived in a rather homogeneous area, and they intentionally took me around on the bus to other places in the city where that were more multicultural, where we had people of different ethnicity, racial groups, and so forth that would get on the bus. And I developed, and I think it's true, a kind of easiness with being in that, almost a preference for being in those kinds of situations. Still to this day, if I'm in a too homogeneous a situation, it feels odd, like what's missing here. And so I give them credit for actually thinking about this.
How old?
I must have been 7 or 8 years old. And then what I will take credit for is the choice to go into the U.S. Peace Corps. Mm-hmm. So the Peace Corps is a program that sends young people more or less just out of college, they call them BA generalists, to go off to some other place in the world, generally so-called developing place. I happened to go to Micronesia, which is out in the Western Pacific on a small island, where you typically have a job like teaching English in the school, but your real job is to engage in so-called community development, which is looking around and trying to find something useful to do. And if you're paying attention, you realize at the end of 2 years that you probably didn't do anything useful, but you did receive a fantastic education. I'm forever grateful to the people that I lived with for putting up with me, particularly for the first year, but probably also for the second year, to have that experience of living. You're not becoming a person of that culture or of that economic situation because you know that you're going to leave it. It's a different story. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, living for a substantial period of time in a different circumstance like that, very simply, and without more money than other people around you, I think is an experience that's quite valuable.
Yeah. Thank you. So we talked about personal experience that made you become an interculturalist. What are scientific persons? What are your gurus? What are people people who inspired you in your work?
And then I became inspired, not so much by the interculturalists initially, but by the people who were studying consciousness and communication theory. So I remember at an early age being inspired by Paul Watzlawick and his work of interpersonal communication and systemic interaction. Gregory Bateson was an inspiration to me. These were people that I ran into in my master's program, for the most part, through my mentor at that time, Dean Barmeyer.
Did you meet them personally?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Both, in that case. Then somebody I didn't meet, but who has turned out to be somebody who's now influencing me, is called Julian Jaynes, who wrote a book about origin of consciousness, and I'm using his work now to reflect on the newness of human consciousness and what that means to the current situation that we're in. Another really important person to me was Humberto Montoyana, whom I've met and spent time with, who is a Chilean biologist and a person well known in the sort of radical constructivist school. So mostly it was those people, and it was through that lens that I went back to Edward T. Hall and Rutherford and the other people that would be the foundation of intercultural communication.
Yeah. Okay. You did a doctorate in intercultural communication and sociology. You just talked about this interdisciplinary view. So what are the advantages of interdisciplinarity for intercultural research?
Well, there really is no good theory of intercultural. for the most part, intercultural is a practice, and frequently it's a practice born of personal experience, and that people are translating their personal experience into training, into contemplation of things. The closest thing we have to a theory would be like Hall's notions of culture as communication. The developmental model of intercultural sensitivity that I developed comes close to a theory, although it actually probably still has the status of a theoretical model rather than a full-blown theory. But the attempts to create a theory like anxiety reduction theory, Kunst, have for the most part drawn on other disciplines. So that one comes out of sociology. The major theories in intercultural have come out of communication theory, in my opinion. So intercultural really is referring to a condition, I would say, rather than to a body of knowledge. And we need to draw on other disciplines to bring the body of knowledge around that condition so as to inform the condition.
Yeah. Interesting. Milton, where do you see your most important or significant scientific contributions?
Well, I think that certainly most other people would say so, and I guess I would mostly agree, that the definition of a developmental process that's theoretically grounded has been the most important contribution. When people Google me, it comes up with DMIS, and so I have to accept that no matter what I might think, that's what I'm known for, right? And in fact, I remind people that it's called DMIS, not the Bennett model, or the Bennett scale. People do things like that. And so, and I'm happy to own the idea that is an important contribution, that the idea of using perceptual complexity or sophistication to explain how it is that we might have experiences of otherness, experiences of difference that move from relatively non-existent or simple, as in stereotyping, through these somewhat more complex but over-generalized, what I call minimization, where we're saying, well, you have 2 arms, I have 2 arms, what's the problem? To accepting our equal complexity but difference, to then being able to actually shift perspective, both cognitively and intuitively, in such a way that we can generate alternative behavior, and then to incorporate that into some kind of ongoing assessment of situations, ethical analysis, and things like that. Yeah, I think that's a good contribution. It's systematic, meaning that you can use it for diagnosis. You can use it to measure change, which, that instrument I helped develop years ago, which I'm no longer associated with, the IDI, but, it remains, I think, useful for looking at change. I have some questions about its other uses, but, I think it continues to be a good research tool in that regard. Outside of that, I'd say the next contribution that I'm hope to be known for as time goes by is the idea of paradigm, of shifting paradigms, particularly shifting from a relativist to a constructivist paradigm. So I think we're going through it right now. I think that we've already shifted from a more positivist to a relativist paradigm. Lots of reasons why you would say we've shifted into a postmodern condition, and intercultural work is essentially located in postmodernism in any case. But now the next shift, as of course, is up for grabs. Meaning there are the postmodernists that are in some ways trying to extend postmodernism into a kind of such a highly contextual condition that every individual has to be treated differently from every other individual. Essentially, this throws out the concept of culture. I think that's a mistake. It's a kind of radical individualism, and I think that doesn't lead us in very good directions. That would be a longer conversation, but there are some political problems with that, as well as conceptual problems. So an alternative, I think, is to take more responsibility for our construction of the conceptual boundaries. And so when we talk about culture, it's not like we're talking about a thing. It's like we're talking about a boundary condition that we have created. We have constructed a boundary condition for some reason. Why? Well, it's to differentiate the behavior of this group from the behavior of that group. Why? Well, I don't know, maybe you want to go move there and you want to learn something about how they might be behaving differently than you are, or you want to be able to understand the worldview so as to generate the appropriate behavior in that context. These are all reasons why you might construct that boundary, but it's nevertheless an arbitrary construction. Culture is a social construction, like race or ethnicity or anything else. It's a social construction. Doesn't mean it's not useful. I would argue that race probably is not a useful one. Most people would agree with me. But I would say that culture is a useful construction and continues to be useful. And so the idea that I have is that we're moving into a more constructivist paradigm in the sense that we are taking responsibility for the construction of these boundaries which are defining culture. And I think you may be later asking another question about what I'm calling observational categories, ways we have of looking at things, but I'll save that for the question.
But you could continue now. I think it's the moment.
You want to move to, okay.
Yeah.
So this goes back to Edward T. Hall's original idea that if we have a highly relativistic system, we need to have, or epistemology, we need to have some way for these different contexts to communicate with one another. And if we believe, as modernists, postmodernists, and sometimes postmodernists believe, that once you're in a context, you're pretty much locked into that context. You're not able to move out of it, so therefore it becomes your filter for everything. This is not a very useful position for people who are moving around amongst contexts, as Hall found out because he was trying to teach business people and development workers and other people whose jobs basically was to move around amongst cultures. And they said, we don't have time to be an anthropologist. We don't have time to learn the language of every place. We just need to know something that will allow us to modify our behavior sufficiently to be effective. And so he came up with the original idea of a constructed etic category. Now, he didn't actually use this term, but looking back at it with a constructivist lens, you can see that he's saying these categories that we have for looking at things like high context, low context, they don't exist. It's not like there are high context cultures and low context cultures, which is a frequent reification, a mistaken, objectification of this idea. He says, rather, it's useful for us to look at the difference between cultures in terms of how high context or how low context they are. This will give you useful information about how to appreciate different communication behavior that's going on, how to potentially modify your own behavior. And so what I've done is extended that idea into a set of, I use 5 usually. One of them is called language use, which has to do with the phatic or kind of ritual uses of language. Why it is that when I ask, how are you, you don't tell me, you say fine, right? That kind of thing. Deborah Tannen is somebody else who in Agenda does a wonderful job in sociolinguistics of talking about that. Nonverbal behavior, which, as again, going back to Edward T. Hall, when he speaks of the silent language, he's not really talking about nonverbal behavior. He's talking about the entire coordination of people's behavior in a group as important to the maintenance of that culture. And I think nonverbal falls into that category. It's part of a general coordinating system, which is not particularly verbal, but which nevertheless is important for us to come to this some agreement on meaning and action, which then allows us to coordinate our behavior, which is what defines the group. And then communication style, how we organize our message, what I'm calling perceptual style these days. There's an article coming out in the new Handbook of Intercultural Training, 3rd edition, that will have a big article on perceptual style. Kind of like cognitive style, but it's a different take on cognitive style. And, of course, cultural values. But again, by putting values into that list, it reminds us that cultures don't have values. Values are not things that are in culture. Values are ways that we have of looking at a comparison between groups for some reason. Why? Well, if you understand that somebody values the future more than the past, this gives you, an idea on how you could organize your experience there in a way that's more meaningful for you and probably more understandable for other people. But the idea is not to find out what values exist, and particularly not to find out what are the universal values. I mean, this really misses the point that these are observational categories. These are things that we construct for the purpose of looking at a difference, that in Gregory Bates's terms, looking at a difference that makes a difference. And to what? Well, in our case, to communication, for the most part.
Great, absolutely.
So, long answer to that one,
no,
sorry.
That's really perfect. That's very, very good. The website of your Intercultural Development Research Institute emphasized just on ethno-relativistic and constructive views of work. So what role does your institute play in the States and in Italy?
What we're trying to do with the Intercultural Development Research Institute, as opposed to the Intercultural Communication Institute, which I originally founded back in 1986, but it's up until fairly recently, it's been running and doing really good work, but I haven't been directly associated with it now for more than a decade. And this other institute is doing something that we never really could do very well with the ICI, the Intercultural Institute. And that is to be a school of thought. A school of thought. And I've been told anyway that the role of institutes in Europe, more than academic departments, which tend to be kind of mixes of all sorts of things, but the institute becomes the school of thought. It becomes the home of a particular approach or a way of thinking, and people know about that, and it disseminates information, and it possibly offers seminars to other. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a European school of thought, and specifically about constructivist, developmental, intercultural sensitivity, intercultural communication competence. I hesitate on the terms because the term, particularly the term competence, is a bit of a moving target on what exactly is meant by it. But I think we can agree that we are looking at the condition of people interacting across what we are assuming to be cultural boundaries, what we treat as cultural boundaries. And in that interaction, there is something that we can study. And typically we call that intercultural communication, intercultural relations or something. And then when we talk about how good people are at doing that, we tend to use the term competence. So just to clarify the way I would use those terms anyway. And I would further say that if we want to understand competence, we need to understand the kind of experience that people are having, which is what I'm calling sensitivity. So the sensitivity underlies the competence, which in turn is the ability to enact these things that we're studying under the rubric intercultural communication.
Great.
Anyway, so that's what we're trying to represent with the Institute. We sponsor research. We try to partner with people who are doing things that are down this line of constructivist work.
Okay. So we looked on the past, we looked on the present and the future. Where do you see the future of intercultural communication in terms of topics? What are interesting, important, relevant topics for intercultural communication?
Yeah, we're going through a change now, I think, in the field. I think, as I've written elsewhere, we've come to the end of relativism, and that intercultural communication is heavily positioned in cultural relativity, as it was originally called, which is kind of one form of the general epistemology of relativism, the idea of essentially our experience is contexted in some way. And that's been an important idea, a very important departure from the idea that there was a single reality and you either knew what that was or you didn't, and you were either high up in that or low in that, and too bad, that's just the way it goes, kind of a social biology notion, social Darwinism. And so the development of this relativism, including cultural relativity, I think was a tremendous contribution to our moving out of that. Not that everybody has moved out of that. We seem to be enamored of politicians who want to keep taking us back to that previous view. But aside from that, academics are for the most part not going back to the idea that there's one absolute truth and we're going to tell you what it is. On the other hand, we've come more or less to the end of this idea that you have your view, I have my view, you have your lenses, I have my lenses. Let me, tell you about your lenses and find out about your own lenses, and then we'll go out and somehow, by having these different lenses, we're going to be better at interacting in these multicultural situations. Doesn't appear to be so easy. And when people say multiculturalism is dead, as which you hear in Europe a lot, I wouldn't say that. I would say multiculturalism is not only alive but growing. What is not working very well is the way that we ourselves are relating to multiculturalism, to the actuality of living in multicultural societies, and we in fact are not doing as good a job as we could be and should be. And I think at least one reason for that is we are limited by the perspective that we've been bringing in intercultural work. The alternative is we just haven't been doing enough of it, which is the sort of easier answer, which is if people would just pay us and support us, then we could bring these wonderful ideas in and they would work. The alternative is they're not really working very well, And I'm tending in that direction and saying, I think that this, the way that we have, that we've incorporated relativism into our thinking has led us a little bit too much into the it's not bad or good, it's just different. And you can't build a multicultural society on that principle. You must make ethical decisions. We have to coordinate our behavior. We can't just say, oh, you do your thing and I my thing, because we're not coordinated then, and we're not a group of people. We're a heap of people. We're not a culture. We fragment into this little group and this little group and this little group, and that's pretty much what's happening. For failure to have not a unifying concept, because that was the old positivist notion, but a way of generating sufficient coordination for us to get past that fragmentation. And that coordination, I don't think, comes from a you do your thing, I do my thing, and that's the end of the story. We need to be becoming more sophisticated in how it is that we construct realities and take responsibility for the construction of the realities, which we then more or less agree to abide by, even though we know that they're constructed realities. And it's difficult, because if we fall back into the idea of let's do it because it's the real thing, then we're back into like social Darwinism. But if we say, oh well, it's constructed, so who's to say I should impose my construction on you? Well, there's a point there as well, which is, and there has been, of course, and continues to be in critical theory, a concern with how it is that dominant cultures use their power to impose their particular view of reality on everybody else. That said, the answer to that is not to say to people, don't do that. Because what we did before that was to say there's one reality, and if you're not me, you're a savage. So not doing the imposition of power is not the answer. The answer is to use power in a way that generates equitable conditions for all of us that we can agree to. And power can be used in that way, and it needs to be, but it's a much more self-conscious process. It's something where we have to be aware of doing it, take responsibility for doing it, not rationalize our doing it on the basis of some supernatural force telling us that that's the way it is, or saying that's the way reality is, because those concepts are easily and right at this very moment being manipulated by people that in fact want to impose their view on you. So we need to figure out how to construct alternative realities in equitable ways and mutually take responsibility for that. That's what I think the future of our direction, of our field is. I can become a little more specific about, if you'd like for me to mention a kind of organizational application of this.
Okay. Good.
in organizational terms, we can talk about this as a shift from a tactical position to a strategic position, where the tactical position is largely, let us give you some tricks, let us tell you some do's and don'ts, or maybe in a more sophisticated way, give you ideas on how to adapt your behavior differently to go into these other cultures. It's a useful thing, I think, but it's largely tactical, and in organizational terms, it leads to cost savings, but it doesn't lead to added value. When we try to apply that concept to things like the value of diversity, it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, it doesn't lead to any better understanding of how to derive the value of diversity, which we know doesn't occur because you have diverse people around. We always have diverse people around. Increasingly, we have diverse people around, and that could be valuable or not, depending on what you do with it. So the question is, what do we do with it? And that's a strategic issue. It's an organizational issue. It's an issue that goes beyond training individuals to be more sensitive or competent. It goes into the coordinating level of the organization, and it asks us, in this case as intercultural experts, to be able to speak to that coordinating level in organizations with sufficient sophistication so that we could say to not just a corporation but to a nonprofit or to a government of a society, we could say, we could help you to not only reduce the problems associated with cultural difference, which are inevitably part of social life now, but we can say how to move towards deriving added value from that. In other words, to make a reality of the rhetoric, which is our society is built, the value of our society is built from multiculturalism, and a lot of societies say that, innovation and new blood, and but in fact, that's mostly happening by accident, because people don't really know how it's happening. We're in a position to know why it's happening, to specify how we could make that happen better, and to be essentially expert consultants on that topic. I think would be a good direction for us to be going.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Milton. This was great to have you here and to exchange, and your great knowledge for interculturalists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.